All right, everybody. I just wanted to point out one small note here I forgot to do on the first episode. This story is based off of a true story. All right, just so you know. Also, if you want to watch a good movie, there's one on Disney Plus. It is called The Call of the Wild. It has Harrison Ford in it. I highly recommend checking it out. Okay, y'all. Now we're on chapter 8. The Toil of the Trail. A mail carrier, a Scotch half-breed, took charge of Buck's team, along with a dozen other dog teams. The sleds were loaded up with sacks of mail, and the dogs started back over the weary trail to Dawson. The running was hard now. The loads were heavy. There was toil each day. There were no record times. Buck did not like it, but he pulled hard and took pride in his work, just like Dave and Solix did. As leader, he made sure that every dog did his fair share of the work. It was a boring life, but one day was very much like another. At a certain time each morning, the cooks turned out, fires were built, and breakfast was eaten. Then, while some broke camp, others harnessed the dogs, and they were underway an hour or so before dawn. At night, camp was made. Some pitched the tents, others cut firewood and collected pine branches for the beds. Still, others carried water or ice for the cooks. Then the dogs were fed their meal of fish. This was the one time of day when the team could relax for an hour or so with the other dogs. Best of all, Buck loved to lie near the fire, with his eyes blinking dreamily at the flames. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sunny Santa Clara Valley, and of the swimming tank. But more often he remembered the man in the red sweater, the death of Curly, the great fight with Spitz, and the good things he had eaten or would like to eat. He was not homesick. His old home was a very dim and distant memory, but far more powerful were his instincts. These new instincts seemed to come from ancestors long ago, from a time when the dog was a wild breed running with the wilder sort of man. Sometimes, as he crouched there, blinking at the flames, it seemed that the flames were of another fire. As if in a dream, he saw a different man from the Canadian cook in front of him. This other man had short, muscular legs and long arms. The hair was long and matted. He uttered strange sounds and seemed very much afraid of the darkness as he peered into it. He clutched a stick with a heavy stone at one end. He was a hairy, primitive man, a primordial man. He did not stand up straight, but leaned forward from the hips or on legs that bent at the knees, as if ready to pounce out of fear. At other times, this hairy man squatted by the fire with his head between his legs and slept. And beyond that fire, in the darkness, Buck could see many gleaming eyes, always 2 by 2, which he knew to be the eyes of great beasts of prey. And he could hear the crashing of their bodies through the undergrowth and the noises they made in the night. These sounds and sights of this dreamlike world would make the hair rise along his back. He would whimper low or growl softly, and the cook would shout at him, "Hey, you Buck, wake up!" Then the other world would vanish, and the real world would come into his eyes. He would get up and yawn and stretch, as though he had been asleep. The loads of mail were heavy, and this was a hard trip. The work wore the dogs down. They were in poor condition when they finally pulled into Dawson, and should have had a week-long rest. But within 2 days' time, they were loaded up again to take more mail loads. The dogs were tired, the drivers grumbled, and to make matters worse, it snowed every day. This meant a soft trail and heavier pulling for the dogs. The drivers were fair through it all, and did their best for the dogs. Each night the dogs were attended to first. They ate before the drivers ate, and no man went to sleep without first checking on the feet of the dogs he drove. Still their strength went down. Since the beginning of the winter, they had traveled nearly 2,000 miles, dragging sleds the whole weary distance. Buck stood it, leading his team well, though he too was very tired. Billy cried and whimpered in his sleep each night. Joe was more sour than ever, and Solex only wanted to be left alone. But it was Dave who suffered most of all. He became more sad and irritable. When camp was pitched, he made his nest at once, where his driver fed him. He did not get on his feet again till harness up time in the morning. He often cried out in pain in the traces. The driver examined him, but could find nothing. All the drivers became interested in his case. They talked it over at mealtime. He was brought from his nest to the fire and was pressed and prodded till he cried out many times. Something was wrong inside him, but they could find no broken bones. By the time they reached Cassier Bar, he was so weak that again and again he fell in the traces. The Scotch mail carrier called a halt and took him out of the team, making the next dog, Solex, the new wheeler next to the sled. He wanted to give Dave a rest and let him run free behind the sled. Sick as he was, Dave would have no part of this. He growled while his traces were removed. He whimpered broken-heartedly when he saw Solex in the position he had held and served so long. His pride was hurt, and this was more painful than his illness. He could not bear that another dog should do his work. When the sled started, Dave ran alongside the team, trying to get back into his place, crying with grief and pain. The driver whipped him, but he paid no attention to the stings. The man didn't have the heart to strike harder. Dave struggled to run behind the sled. Then he fell howling as the long train of sleds went by. With the last bit of his strength, he managed to stagger along behind until the train made another stop. He somehow reached his own sled and stood alongside Solex. His driver stopped a moment to get a light for his pipe. Then he returned and started his dogs. They swung out on the trail with no effort at all, but then stopped in surprise. The driver was surprised too. The sled had not moved. He called the other men over to see the strange sight. Dave had bitten through both of Solex's traces and was standing directly in front of the sled in his proper place. The dog pleaded with his eyes to remain there. Since Dave was dying, the men agreed that he should die in the traces where he wanted to be. So he was harnessed in, and he proudly pulled again, though more than once he cried out from a pain within him. He held out till camp was reached, and his driver made a place for him by the fire. In the morning he was too weak to travel. His strength had left him, and he was dying. He could not be harnessed, and the team went on without him. The whips snapped, the bells jingled merrily, the sleds churned along the trail. Buck knew, and every dog knew, they would never see Dave again. All right, Chapter 9, The Tenderfeet. 30 days from the time they left Dawson, Buck and his team arrived at Skagway. They were worn out and worn down. Buck's 140 pounds had gone down to 115. The rest of his mates had lost weight too. Pike limped with a hurt leg, Solex was also limping, and Dub was suffering from a hurt shoulder blade. The dogs were all very footsore. Their feet plodded along with no joy for the work. The months of constant toil left them with no strength. It had all been used. Every muscle, every fiber, every cell was tired, dead tired, and there was reason for it. In less than 5 months, they had traveled 2,500 miles with little or no rest. When they arrived at Skagway, they were on their last legs. "Mush on, poor sore feets," the driver said as they slowly staggered down the main street of Skagway. "This is de last. Then we get one long rest, eh? For sure, one long rest." The drivers expected a long stopover. They deserved a rest and a chance to relax. But there were so many men who had rushed to the Klondike in search of gold that the mail loads had increased. Fresh teams of dogs were brought in to take the places of the worn-out teams. These worthless dog teams were no longer useful on the mail runs, and so these teams were sold. After only 3 days of rest, Buck's team, harness and all, was bought by 2 men from the United States. The men called each other Hal and Charles. Charles was a man about age 40 with watery eyes and a mustache that twisted up. Hal was a young man of 19 or 20 with a big revolver and a hunting knife strapped to his belt. Both men were out of place. They were tenderfeet, newcomers who did not know the ways of the wild north. The new owner's camp was a mess. The tent was put up poorly and the dishes were not washed. There was also a woman with them called Mercedes. She was Charles's wife and Hal's sister. 3 tenderfeet in one family. Buck watched the 2 men take the camp apart and load the sled. They did not know how to roll the tent. The tin dishes were packed away unwashed. Mercedes kept complaining and giving advice to Hal and Charles. They packed and unpacked several times, never getting things just right for Mercedes. 3 men from a neighboring tent came out and looked on, grinning and winking at one another. "You've got a right big load as it is," said one of them. "It's not for me to say, but I wouldn't tote that tent along if I was you." "Nonsense," cried Mercedes. "However in the world could I manage without a tent? It's springtime, ma'am, and you won't get any more cold weather," the man replied. She shook her head at the men. "You think that sled will ride?" one of the men asked. "Why shouldn't it?" Charles demanded. "I was just a-wondering, that is all. It seemed a mite top-heavy," said the man. Charles turned his back and tied the bundles down as best he could, which was rather sloppily. "And of course the dogs can hike all day with the top-heavy load, eh?" came another comment. "Certainly," said Hal. He took hold of the gee pole with one hand and the whip with the other. "Mush," he shouted. "Mush on there." The dogs sprang forward, strained hard for a few moments, then relaxed. They were unable to move the sled. "The lazy brutes, I'll show them," Hal cried, raising his whip. But Mercedes cried, "Oh, Hal, you mustn't." She caught hold of the whip and pulled it from him. "The poor dears. Now you must promise you won't be harsh with them for the rest of the trip, or I won't go a step." "You know nothing about dogs," her brother sneered, "and I wish you'd leave me alone. They're lazy, I tell you, and you got to whip them to get anything out of them. That's their way. You ask anyone. Ask one of those men." Mercedes looked at the men. "They're much too weak, if you want to know," replied one. "Plumb tuckered out. That's what's the matter. They need a rest." "Rest indeed," snarled Hal. "Never mind that, man," Mercedes said. "You're driving our dogs, and you do what you think best with them." Again Hal's whip fell upon the dogs. They threw themselves forward, dug their feet into the packed snow, got down low to it, and put forth all their strength. The sled would not move. After 2 efforts, they stood still panting. Hal's whip kept singing. Mercedes stopped the whipping, dropped on her knees before Buck, and with tears in her eyes, put her arms around his neck. "You poor dears," she cried. "Why don't you pull hard? Then you wouldn't be whipped." Buck did not like her. An onlooker spoke up. "I don't care a whoop what becomes of you, but for the dogs' sake, I just want to tell you this. You can help them a mighty lot by breaking out the sled. The runners are frozen in the icy snow. Throw your weight against the gee pole right and left and break it out." After a 3rd try, Hal broke out the runners, which had been frozen in the snow. The dogs managed to pull the overloaded sled down the path, but when the path turned onto the main street, the top-heavy sled went over, spilling half its load. The dogs never stopped. The sled bounded on its side behind them. Buck was raging at the whippings they had received. He broke into a run, and the team followed his lead. "Whoa, whoa," Hal cried out. He tripped and was pulled off his feet. The dogs dashed on up the street as they scattered the remainder of the gear along the main street of Skagway. The dogs and the scattered gear and clothes were rounded up. "You need just half the load and twice the dogs if you ever expect to reach Dawson," the men told Charles, Hal, and Mercedes. Mercedes cried while she went through clothes, deciding what to keep, although they went through every article until the load was cut in half. It was still too bulky. Charles and Hal went out that evening and bought 6 outsider dogs. This brought their team up to 14, but the newcomer dogs did not amount to much. They did not seem to know anything. Buck speedily taught them their places and what not to do, but he could not teach them what to do. They did not take kindly to trace and trail. The 2 men were quite proud and cheerful as they set off down the trail with 14 dogs not ready for the hard work ahead. 8 dogs were dead tired, and 6 dogs had never pulled a sled, but 14 dogs they had. They had never seen a sled with so many as 14 dogs. In the Arctic, there was a reason why 14 dogs should not drag one sled. This was that one sled could not carry the food needed for 14 dogs. But Charles and Hal did not know this. They had worked the trip out with a pencil. So much to a dog, so many dogs, and so many days. It was all so very simple. Buck felt that he could not depend upon these 2 men and the woman. They did not know how to do anything and did not want to learn. They were lazy. It took them half the night to pitch camp and half the morning to break that camp and get the sled loaded. Yet the work was so sloppy that for the rest of the day they had to stop to rearrange the load. Some days they did not make 10 miles. On other days they were unable to get started at all, and all the while the food supply was going down. Chapter 10. Hitting the Bottom. Of course they ran short on dog food. Charles and Hal overfed the dogs at first. The 6 outsider dogs had big appetites. Mercedes, with tears in her pretty eyes, could not get Charles to give the dogs more. So she stole from the fish sacks and fed them secretly. But it was not food that Buck and the Huskies needed most. It was rest. And though they were making poor time, the heavy load they dragged took all their strength away. Then the underfeeding began. Hal realized one day that his dog food was half gone and they had covered very little distance. They could not get more dog food, so he cut down on even the usual amount and tried to increase the day's travel. It was easy to give the dogs less food, but it was impossible to make the dogs travel faster. The men didn't know how to work dogs. They didn't even know how to work themselves. The first to go was Dub. Poor thief that he was, always getting caught and punished, he had still been a faithful worker. The outsider dogs did not last. One by one they died. By this time, there was no joy in this Arctic adventure for any of the 3 people. Mercedes no longer wept over the dogs. She only wept over herself, except when she was quarreling with her husband and brother, and the three did quarrel. They were stiff and in pain. Their muscles ached, their bones ached, their very hearts ached. They had only hard words for each other. In the meantime, the fire remained unbuilt, the camp half-pitched, and the dogs unfed. They thought only of their own misery and gave no thought to the animals. Through it all, Buck staggered along at the head of the starved team as if in a nightmare. He pulled when he could. When he could no longer pull, he fell down and remained down till blows from whip or club drove him to his feet again. His once beautiful fur was dulled and matted. He had become so thin that each rib and every bone in his body showed through his loose hide. It was heartbreaking, yet Buck's heart was unbreakable. The man in the red sweater had proved that many months before. Buck's team of 6 dogs looked like skeletons. They no longer felt the pain of the whip, and their eyes looked lifeless. When the team stopped, they dropped down in the traces like dead dogs, with no spark left. When the club or whip fell upon them, the spark somehow fluttered, and they tottered to their feet and staggered on. There came a day when Billy, the good-natured, fell and could not rise. Buck and the others knew their own time would be soon. On the next day, Kuna went, and only 5 of them remained. Joe was too ill to be mean. Pike was crippled and limping. Solex, the one-eyed, was still faithful to his work, even in his agony. Teek, who had not traveled so far that winter, had been beaten more than the others, and Buck was still at the head of the team, but he was too weak to lead the starved, weary dogs. The dogs were falling. Mercedes was weeping and riding. Hal and Charles were arguing. This was what they were doing when they staggered into John Thornton's camp at the mouth of the White River. When they stopped, the dogs dropped down as though they had all been struck dead. Mercedes dried her eyes and looked at John Thornton. Charles sat down on a log to rest. Hal did the talking. John Thornton was whittling an axe handle. He whittled and listened, gave short replies and very little advice. He knew this type of traveler, and he knew they would not listen to advice. John Thornton did tell them not to take chances on the ice. Hal waved his hand toward the frozen White River. They told us up in Skagway that we couldn't make White River, and here we are, said Hal with a jeer. They said we should stay away from travel over ice, but we made it. And they told you true, John Thornton answered. The ice is likely to bottom out at any moment. Only lucky fools could have made it. I tell you straight, I wouldn't risk my life on that ice for all the gold in Alaska. That's because you're not a fool, I suppose, said Hal. All the same, we'll go on to Dawson. He took out his whip. Get up there, Buck. Hi, get up there, mush on. Thornton went on whittling. He knew these fools would not listen. But the team did not get up at the command, and so the whip flashed out. John Thornton watched in silence. Solex was the first to crawl to his feet. Teek followed. Joe came next, yelping with pain. Pike made painful efforts. Twice he fell over, went half up, and on the third attempt managed to rise. Buck made no effort. He lay quietly where he had fallen. The lash bit into him again and again. He did not whine or struggle. Several times Thornton started to speak, but changed his mind. Tears came to his eyes as the whipping went on. This was the first time Buck had failed, and this angered Hal. No matter how he beat Buck, the poor dog would not budge. All day Buck had felt the thin, rotten ice under his feet. He sensed that danger lay ahead. He refused to stir. He felt numb. He no longer felt pain. He was slipping away. And then, suddenly, John Thornton sprang upon Hal. Mercedes screamed. Charles looked on in confusion. John Thornton stood over Buck, enraged. If you strike that dog again, I'll kill you, he said at last. It's my dog, Hal replied. Get out of my way or I'll fix you. I'm going to Dawson. Thornton stood between him and Buck and would not get out of the way. Hal drew his long hunting knife, but Thornton rapped Hal's knuckles with his axe handle, knocking the knife to the ground. Then he picked up the knife himself and with 2 strokes cut Buck's traces. Hal gave up on Buck. What use was he any more anyway? A few minutes later, the tenderfeet pulled out from the bank and out onto the frozen river. Buck heard them go and raised his head to see. Pike was leading. Solex was at the wheel, and between were Joe and Teek. They were limping and staggering. Mercedes was riding the loaded sled. Hal guided at the gee pole, and Charles stumbled along at the back. As Buck watched them, Thornton knelt beside him and petted him with rough but kind hands. Dog and man both watched the sled crawling along over the ice. Suddenly, they saw its back end drop down and the gee pole jerk into the air. Mercedes screamed. They saw Charles turn one step to run back. Then a whole section of ice gave way and dogs and humans disappeared. A white hole in the ice was all that was to be seen. The bottom had dropped out of the trail. John Thornton and Buck looked at each other. You poor devil, said John Thornton, and Buck licked his hand. Chapter 11. For the Love of a Man. When John Thornton's feet froze last December, his partners made sure he was comfortable before they left to get a raft in Dawson. He was still limping slightly at the time he rescued Buck. Together, man and dog lay by the riverbank through the long spring days, watching the running water, listening to the songbirds and the hum of nature. John Thornton improved, and Buck slowly won back his strength. Buck could now be lazy as his wounds healed and his muscles came back to cover his bones. John Thornton's 2 dogs, Skeet and Knight, befriended Buck. Skeet was a little Irish setter who washed and cleansed Buck's wounds. Each morning after he had finished his breakfast, she attended to him. Night was a huge black dog, half bloodhound and half deerhound, with eyes that laughed with a good nature. To Buck's surprise, these dogs showed no jealousy toward him. They seemed to share the kind nature of John Thornton. As Buck grew stronger, they coaxed him into all sorts of ridiculous games, with John Thornton joining in. Buck romped through his time of healing and discovered a new feeling: love. Real love for the first time. He had never really felt this before, not even for Judge Miller, but now Buck came to love and adore John Thornton. This man had saved his life. More than this, he was the ideal master. Other men had fed him and taken care of his needs, but John Thornton took care of his dogs as if they were his own children, because he truly cared. He never forgot to give a kind greeting or a cheering word. To sit down for a long talk with them was as much his delight as theirs. He had a way of taking Buck's head roughly between his hands and resting his own head upon Buck's, playfully shaking him back and forth. He growled names at him and cursed him lovingly. "You mean old rascal," Thornton would say. Buck found joy in the playful embrace, and when the man released him, Buck sprang to his feet with his mouth and eyes laughing. John Thornton would exclaim, "Buck, you can all but speak." Buck expressed his love to this man in his own way. He would often seize Thornton's hand in his mouth and hold tight, biting hard enough to leave marks. Yet the man understood, wrestling the dog with spirit and joy. Most of the time, however, Buck was content to adore from a distance. He went wild with happiness when Thornton touched him or spoke to him, but he did not seek this attention. Skeet liked to shove her nose under Thornton's hand and nudge till she was petted. Night would often walk up and rest his great head on Thornton's knee. But Buck was happy just to lie at Thornton's feet for hours, looking up into his face. He studied the man's expressions and movements, and often John Thornton would sense Buck's gaze and would turn to gaze back at the dog, without speech, his heart shining out of his eyes as Buck's heart shone out too. For a long time after his rescue, Buck did not want Thornton to be out of his sight. From the moment he left the tent to when he entered it again, Buck would follow at his heels. He was afraid that Thornton would pass out of his life as Perrault and Francois and the mail carriers had passed out. Even in the night, in his dreams, he was haunted by this fear. At such times, he would creep through the chilly air to the flap of the tent, where he would stand and listen to the sound of his master's breathing. But in spite of this great love for John Thornton, Buck's primitive nature remained strong within him. He was faithful and devoted to this man who had saved his life, but he could never be tamed again. The cruelty of other men and months on the trail had changed him forever. Deep inside, he was a thing of the wild, come in from the wild to sit by John Thornton's fire. Because of his very great love, he could not steal from this man, but from any other man in any other camp, he did not hesitate to steal. His keen intelligence and primitive instincts were strong. His face and body were marked by the teeth of many dogs, and he still fought as fiercely as ever. Skeet and Night were two good-natured, for quarreling. Besides, they belonged to John Thornton. But any strange dog, no matter what the breed, swiftly gave in to Buck. He had learned well the law of club and fang, and he never showed mercy to any other dog. He had learned well from Spitz, show no weakness, fight to the end. The strongest dog who showed no fear would rule. Buck knew this all too well. Deep in the forest and deep within him, a call was sounding. Even as he lay by John Thornton's warm, safe fire, he heard this call. Then he would turn his back upon the fire and plunge into the forest. He would run on and on, though he knew not where or why. He did not wonder where or why, so strong was the call. But each time the love for John Thornton drew him back to the fire again. Thornton was the only man Buck could love. Sometimes travelers praised or petted Buck, but he would often get up and walk away. When Thornton's partners, Hans and Pete, arrived on the raft, Buck refused to notice them till he learned they were close friends with Thornton. Even then, along the entire raft trip up to Dawson, he mostly ignored these other men. Okay, so they got on the raft and went up. For Thornton, however, his love seemed to grow and grow. He alone, among men, could put a pack upon Buck's back for the summer traveling. Nothing was too great for Buck to do when Thornton commanded. It's uncanny how Thornton and that dog seemed to speak to each other, Pete noted one day. By jingo, you are right, Hans answered. Dat dog, him do anything for that man. I hope no man ever get in the way between them. All right, chapter 12, y'all, the sled pull. In Dawson that winter, Buck showed this uncanny loyalty and love for John Thornton. The three partners had stopped off at a saloon one evening. Black Burton was there, an evil-tempered bully, and he was picking a fight with a young tenderfoot. Trying to hold tempers down, Thornton stepped in between. Buck, as was his custom, was lying in a corner of the room, head on paws, watching his master's every action. Black Burton struck out without warning and hit Thornton. He was sent spinning, and he saved himself from falling only by clutching the rail of the bar. Those who were looking on heard something, not a bark nor a yelp, but something like a roar. They saw Buck's body rise up in the air as he left the floor for Burton's throat. The man saved his life by blocking with his arm, but was hurled backward with Buck on top of him. Then the crowd was upon Buck, and he was driven off. While a doctor attended to Burton, Buck prowled up and down, growling, trying to rush in. Only heavy clubs could drive him back. A meeting was called on the spot, and all agreed that the dog had a just cause for attacking Burton. He was allowed to leave with Thornton, but this reputation was made. From that day, his name spread through every camp in Alaska. Buck, because of his fame, was often compared to other dogs, and Thornton was driven to defend him. When the subject of dogs came up at the El Dorado saloon one night, several men boasted of their favorites. At the end of half an hour, one man stated that his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds and walk off with it. A second man bragged 600 for his dog. A third, a man named Mathewson, boasted that his dog could start 700. Ha, said John Thornton. Buck can start 1,000 pounds. And break it out of the snow and walk off with it for 100 yards, demanded Mathewson. And break it out and walk off with it for 100 yards, replied John Thornton. Well, Mathewson said slowly, so that all could hear, I've got $1,000 that says he can't, and there it is. He slammed a sack of gold dust down upon the bar. Nobody spoke. Thornton could feel a flush of warm blood creeping up his face. He did not know whether Buck could start 1,000 pounds, half a ton. He had great faith in Buck's strength, but how could he put Buck up to such a task? Plus, he didn't have $1,000, and nor did Hans or Pete. The eyes of a dozen men fixed upon him, silent and waiting. I've got a sled standing outside right now with 25-pound sacks of flour on it, Mathewson went on. We can put your dog to the test any time. Thornton did not reply. He did not know what to say. He glanced from face to face, trying to gather his thoughts. The face of Jim O'Brien, an old friend, caught Thornton's eyes. Can you lend me 1,000? He asked Jim, almost in a whisper. Sure, answered O'Brien, thumping down a sack next to Mathewson's. Though I don't think, John, that the dog can do the trick. The saloon emptied into the street. Several hundred men gathered to watch and bet on the outcome. Mathewson's sled, loaded with 1,000 pounds of flour, had been standing for a couple of hours, and the sled runners had frozen fast to the hard-packed snow. Not a man believed the dog could even budge the sled, and they all bet against Buck. Thornton looked at the sled itself with the regular team of 10 dogs still in harness, He had hurried into this foolishly, and the task looked impossible. Matthewson, on the other hand, was quite pleased. 3-to-1 odds, he proclaimed. I'll bet you another $1,000, Thornton. What do you say? Thornton's doubt was strong, but so were his pride and his fighting spirit. The fighting spirit that does not care about the odds. That does not believe something is impossible. Thornton went back into the saloon and called Hans and Pete to him. Together they came up with $200. This was all they had, yet they laid it on the table. The team of 10 dogs was unhitched, and Buck was harnessed into the sled. He felt the excitement in the air, and he felt that in some way he must do a great thing for John Thornton. The men took note of this splendid animal. He was in perfect condition, with 150 pounds of pure muscle and grit. His furry coat shone, and every hair seemed to be alive. Men felt his muscles, proclaimed them hard as iron, and the odds went down to 2-to-1. Gad, sir, stuttered one bearded man. I offer you $800 for him, sir, before the test. 800 just as he stands. Thornton shook his head and stepped over to Buck's side. You must stand off from him, Matthewson protested. The crowd fell silent. Everybody saw that Buck was indeed a magnificent animal, but 1,000 pounds? How could he break out and pull such a load? Thornton knelt down by Buck's side. He took his head in his hands and rested cheek on cheek. He did not playfully shake him, as he usually did, or tease him with words. Instead, he just whispered in his ear, As you love me, Buck, as you love me. Buck whined with an eagerness to please. The crowd was watching curiously. This was odd. A man whispering to his dog? As Thornton got to his feet, Buck seized his mittened hand between his jaws, pressing in with his teeth and then letting go. It was the answer, not of speech, but of love. Thornton stepped well back. Now, Buck, he said. Buck tightened the traces, then let them loosen a bit. It was the way he had learned. Gee! Thornton's voice rang out sharply. Buck swung to the right with all his might. The load quivered, and from under the runners arose a crisp crackling. Haw! Thornton commanded. Buck pulled this time to the left. The crackling turned into a snapping. The runners slipped several inches to the side. The sled was broken out. Every man was holding his breath. Now mush! Thornton's command cracked out like a pistol shot. Buck threw himself forward. His whole body and every muscle went into the effort. His great chest was low to the ground, his head forward and down, while his feet were flying like mad, the claws digging into the hard-packed snow. The sled swayed slightly. One of Buck's feet slipped, and one man groaned aloud. The sled jerked ahead, half an inch, 2 inches. The jerks became fewer until the sled was moving ahead slowly, then steadily. Men gasped and began to breathe again. Thornton was running behind, encouraging Buck with short, cheery words. As he neared the pile of firewood that marked the end of the 100 yards, a cheer began to grow and grow, which burst into a roar as he passed the firewood and halted at command. Every man began to jump with joy and wonder, even Matthewson. Hats and mittens were flying in the air. Men were shaking hands and bubbling over in a general excitement. But Thornton fell on his knees beside Buck. Head was against head, and he was shaking him back and forth. Those close by heard him, roughing it up and growling words at Buck, softly and lovingly. You old rascal, you darned old rascal. I'll give you $1,000 for him, sir. 1,000, sir, exclaimed the bearded man. Thornton rose to his feet. His eyes were wet. The tears were streaming down his cheeks. Sir, he said. No, sir. You can forget it, sir. Buck seized Thornton's hand in his teeth. Thornton shook him back and forth. Man and dog romped alone within their special love for each other, while all the men looked on in wonder. All right, y'all, we're on Chapter 13, The Sounding of the Call. $1,600. Buck earned John Thornton enough money to travel with his partners into the east in search of a lost gold mine. Many men had looked for it, few had found it, and many had never returned from this search. Yet there were stories that told of this lost mine near an old cabin, a mine with the most fantastic gold nuggets. John Thornton, Pete, and Hans, with Buck and 6 other dogs, went in search of this old cabin and this treasure. John Thornton was not afraid of the wild. He was at home on any trail. He hunted for food and traveled light. To Buck, it was a great life, this hunting, fishing, and wandering through strange places. The months came and went. They faced blizzards and bitter cold in the winter months, and gnats and flies in the warm months. They rafted across blue mountain lakes and drifted down rivers in slender boats carved from tree trunks. Sometimes they went hungry, sometimes they feasted. This was adventure. And through another winter they wandered. Then spring came on once more, and at the end of all their wandering they found not the lost mine and old cabin, but a shallow placer, a deposit of gravel where gold is often found. Here the gold showed like yellow butter across the bottom of the washing pan. Each day they earned thousands of dollars in clean dust and nuggets, and they worked every day. The gold was sacked in moose hide bags, 50 pounds to the bag, with no more thought of the lost mine. They heaped their treasure up. There was very little for the dogs to do, and Buck spent long hours by the fire. The vision of the short-legged hairy man came to him more often. Buck gazed into the fire and could see the hairy man the hairy man as if in a dream, living with fear in that other world. He watched the hairy man sleeping by the fire, crouched with his hands over his head in fear. Sometimes Buck dreamed that they walked on a beach, gathering shellfish. Even then, the hairy man was alert to hidden danger, ready to run like the wind. Buck felt the wild stirrings of his own soul. The visions of the hairy man told him of the days of his ancestors, but the sounds and calls from the forest told him of a new life waiting now. Sometimes he followed the call into the forest, looking for it, barking softly. He would thrust his nose into the earth and moss. He would crouch for hours, wide-eyed and wide-eared, to all that moved and sounded around him. When the call came to him, he listened. He would be dozing lazily in camp when suddenly his head would lift and his ears cock up, listening. He would spring to his feet and dash away, on and on for hours, through the forest and across the open spaces. For a day at a time he would lie in the underbrush where he could watch the birds and wildlife. But especially he loved to run at midnight, listening to the sleepy murmurs of the forest and seeking the mysterious something that called. It called, waking or sleeping, at all times for him to come. One night he sprang from sleep with a start, with a scent in his nostrils. From the forest came the call, a long howl, and he knew it, in the old familiar way, as a sound he had heard before. He sprang through the sleeping camp and dashed through the woods. As he drew closer to the cry, he went more slowly, with caution in every movement, till he came to an open place among the trees. Looking out, he saw a long, lean timber wolf with his nose pointed to the sky. Buck had made no noise, yet the wolf stopped howling. Buck stalked into the open, half crouching, with his tail straight and stiff. He was ready for either an attack or surrender, but the wolf fled at the sight of him. Buck followed with wild leapings. He ran the wolf into a jammed creek bed, cornering him. The wolf whirled about, snarling and clipping his teeth together. Buck did not attack, but circled about him in a friendly manner. The wolf was suspicious and afraid. Seeing his chance, the wolf darted away, and the chase was on again. Time and again he was cornered, and then the wolf would escape. But in the end, the wolf surrendered to Buck's chase, and finally sniffed noses with him. Then they became friendly and romped about like brothers. After some time of this, the wolf started off in a way that plainly showed he was going somewhere. He made it clear to Buck that he was to come. They ran side by side through the early morning hours, straight up the creek bed and up onto the mountainside. They came down into a large forest with many streams, and through this wild area they ran on, hour after hour. The sun rose higher and the day grew warmer. Buck was wildly glad. He knew he was at last answering the call, running by the side of his wood brother toward the place where he where where the call came from. Instincts and old memories were stirring within him. He had done this thing before, somewhere in that other world, his dream world. And he was doing it again now, running free in the open with the wide sky overhead. They stopped by a running stream to drink. Then Buck remembered John Thornton. He sat down. The wolf started on toward the place from where the call surely came, then returned to Buck, sniffing noses. But Buck turned about and started slowly back to camp. For an hour, the wild brother ran by his side, whining softly. Then he sat down, pointed his nose upward, and howled. It was a sad howl, and as Buck trotted back to camp, he heard it grow faint and then fainter until it was lost in the distance. John Thornton was eating dinner when Buck dashed into camp and sprang upon him in a playful romp, licking his face, biting his hand. John Thornton shook Buck back and forth and growled and spoke to him lovingly. For 2 days and nights, Buck never left camp and never left Thornton out of his sight. He followed him about at his work, watched him while he ate, saw him into his blankets at night and out of them in the morning. But after 2 days, the call in the forest began to sound more than ever. Buck thought of his wild brother and of the smiling, wild land that lay outside camp. Once again he took to wandering in the woods, but the wild brother came no more. Buck listened every night. The sad howl was never raised. Chapter 14, Into the Wilds. Buck began to sleep out at night, staying away from camp for days at a time. Once he crossed the mountain and went down into the land of timber and streams. There he wandered for a week, looking for his wild brother. He fished for salmon and hunted for his food. He killed only to eat, and he was quick, smart, and crafty. No prey was too swift for him, bird, rabbit, or beaver. By the stream he killed a large black bear that was blinded by the mosquitoes. The bear had raged through the forest with Buck at his heels. It was a hard fight, but Buck took the bear down. He was a master in the wild. Buck could rely on his own strength and power. His pride showed in the way he carried himself in every muscle. He looked like a gigantic wolf, and he was cunning like a wolf. Yet he had the intelligence of his shepherd mother and St. Bernard father. All this made him one of the fiercest creatures to roam the wild. Every part of him was aware of the sounds and smells and sights around him. He could think faster than any dog and hunt as well as any wild wolf. Even the men noticed that Buck was special. Never was there such a dog, said John Thornton one day, as they watched Buck march out of camp. When he was made, the mold was broke, said Pete. "I'd think so myself," Hans affirmed. They saw Buck marching out of camp, but they did not see the instant and terrible change that took place as soon as he was within the forest. There he became a thing of the wild, stealing along softly, cat-footed, like a passing shadow. As the fall of the year came on, the moose herds began to appear. Buck came upon a band of 20 moose one day at the creek. Their chief was a great bull moose, standing over 6 feet from the ground. Buck watched the bull moose. Here was a challenge. Back and forth the bull tossed his great antlers. His small eyes glared as he roared with fury at the sight of Buck. A feathered arrow was sticking out of the bull's side. He was wounded, and Buck took note of this. Buck followed the bull moose and cut him off from the others. Buck barked and danced about in front of the bull, just out of the reach of the great antlers and terrible hoofs. The bull was driven into a rage. He charged at Buck, but the crafty dog backed away, toying with the great animal. Buck was patient. For half a day, he kept at the wounded bull. He attacked from all sides, keeping the moose from rejoining the others. The herd tried to help their leader from time to time, but they soon tired of the fierce dog. As night came, the weary old bull stood with his head lowered. He watched the other moose as they went off in search of food. He could not follow. The fanged dog would not let him go. He was a grand animal, and he had lived a long, strong life. At the end, he faced death at the teeth of another grand animal, a new king. From then on, night and day, Buck never left the moose. He would not let him eat. He would not let him drink. Buck kept at him, nipping at his legs, waiting for the great bull moose to grow weaker and weaker. At last, at the end of the 4th day, he pulled the great moose down. For a day and a night he remained by the kill, eating and sleeping. Then he turned his face toward camp and John Thornton. As he set out on the path for home, he could feel a new stir in the land. He knew, not by sight or sound or smell, but by some other sense, that new life was coming into the land. The birds talked of it, the squirrels chattered about it, the very breeze whispered of it. Several times he stopped and drew in the fresh morning air in great sniffs. He read a message which made him leap on with greater speed. He now felt a sense of dread, and as he dropped down into the valley toward camp, he proceeded with greater caution. 3 miles away he came upon a fresh trail that sent his neck hair bristling. It led straight toward camp and John Thornton. Buck hurried on swiftly, with every nerve tense, alert to the details which told a story, all but the end. He noticed the silence of the forest, as if all life was in hiding. As Buck slid along like a shadow, his nose picked up a scent that pulled him toward a thicket. There he found Night. He was lying on his side, dead, with a feathered arrow through his body. From the camp came the faint sound of many voices rising and falling in a sing-song chant. Bellying forward to the edge of the clearing, he found Hans lying on his face, feathered with arrows. Then Buck peered out through the trees and saw what made his hair leap, straight up on his neck and shoulders. Rage swept over him. He did not know that he growled so loudly. His reason left him, and his great love for John Thornton made him react without thinking. The Yeehats were dancing about the camp's fire when they heard a fearful roaring and saw rushing upon them an animal, a strange and fierce animal they had never seen before. It was Buck, a live hurricane of fury, hurling himself upon them in a frenzy to destroy. He sprang at the closest man, the chief of the Yeehats, grabbing his throat. He did not pause, but leaped upon a second man. He plunged so quickly that every arrow missed him. In fact, the surprised Indians were so close together and so frantic that they shot one another with the arrows. Then a panic seized the Yeehats, and they fled in terror to the woods, yelling as they fled that the evil spirit had come. And truly Buck was the evil spirit, raging at their heels and dragging them down like deer as they raced through the trees. It was a fateful day for the Yeehats. They scattered, and it was not till a week later that the last of the survivors gathered together in a lower valley and counted their losses. Buck, weary of the chase, returned to the empty camp. He found Pete dead in the blankets. Thornton's own struggle was fresh written on the earth, and Buck scented every detail of it down to the edge of the deep pool. By the water's edge lay Skeet, faithful to the end. The pool was muddy, and Buck could not see what it contained, but he knew that it contained John Thornton, for Buck followed his trace into the water. No trace led away. All day Buck brooded by the pool or roamed about the camp. Buck knew death, and he knew John Thornton was dead. It left him empty. He ached, and nothing could fill this emptiness. At times when he paused at the bodies of the Yeehats, he forgot his pain. He was aware of a great pride in himself. He had killed man, and he had killed in the face of the law of club and fang. Never again would he fear this animal. Now, Chapter 15. Buck Answers the Call. Night came on, and a full moon rose high over the trees into the sky. Buck, lying next to the pool, lifted his head from his mourning and brooding. He stood up, listening and scenting. From far away drifted a faint, sharp yelp, followed by more sharp yelps. He walked to the center of the open space and listened. It was the call of the wild. And now he was ready to follow. John Thornton was dead. The last tie with man was broken. A wolf pack had crossed over from the land of streams and timber and invaded Buck's valley. Into the clearing they poured, lit by the moonlight. In the center of the clearing stood Buck, as still as a statue, waiting for them. They stopped in wonder at this large creature before them. The boldest one leaped straight for him. Like a flash, Buck struck, breaking the neck. 3 others tried it, and one after the other they drew back, cut, and slashed. The whole pack then closed in. Buck was too quick and too smart for them. Whirling on his hind legs and snapping and gnashing, he was everywhere at once, leaping from side to side. To prevent the pack from getting behind him, he was forced back down into the creek bed. Here, he was finally backed against a high gravel bank. He turned and faced the pack. For half an hour, no wolf could take the cornered beast, and the wolves drew back. They remained there. Some were lying down, others were on their feet, watching him. Still, others were lapping water from the pool. One wolf, long and lean and gray, came to Buck slowly in a friendly manner. Buck recognized his wild brother with whom he had run for a night and a day. He was whining softly, and as Buck whined, they touched noses. Then an old battle-scarred wolf came forward. Buck snarled his lips, but sniffed noses with him. The old wolf sat down, pointed nose at the moon, and broke out the long wolf howl. The others sat down and howled, and now the call came to Buck. He, too, sat down and howled. The pack crowded around him, sniffing. The leaders lifted the call of the pack and sprang away into the woods. The wolves swung in behind, yelping in chorus, and Buck ran with them, side by side with the wild brother, yelping as he ran. And here may well end the story of Buck. But it was not many years before the Yeehats noted a change in the breed of timber wolves. Some had splashes of brown on head and muzzle, and a strip of white down the chest. But more remarkable than this, the Yeehats tell of a ghost dog that runs at the head of the pack. They are afraid of this ghost dog, for it has great cunning, stealing from their camps, robbing their traps, and killing their dogs. Nay, the tale grows worse. The Indians tell of hunters who never returned to camp, and they tell of hunters found dead, with wolf prints about them in the snow. These prints were far greater than the prints of any wolf. Each fall, when the Yeehats follow the moose herds, there is a certain valley they never enter. There are women who become sad when the tale is told around the fire on how the evil spirit came to live in the valley. In the summers, there is one visitor to that valley, however, that the Yeehats never see. It is a great, beautiful wolf, unlike all other wolves. He comes alone from the timber land and walks down into an open space among the trees. Here, a golden stream flows into a still pond. He stays by the pond for a time, howling once, long and mournfully, before he departs. But he is not always alone. When the long winter nights come on, he may be seen running at the head of the pack through the pale moonlight. With a great cry from deep within him, he sings a song of the wild, which is the song of the pack. And that's the end of it, y'all.